We have members from many countries around the world, many volunteers coming here, and a few hundred Nepali staff working in our hospitals and out in the villages around the country trying to address poverty in the name and spirit of Christ. And climate change has been a growing challenge for Nepal over the last few decades. The overall picture in Nepal is similar to many other countries in the world. We've been seeing the average summer temperatures get hotter. Some places in the world see more rain, some see less. Nepal is seeing about the same amount, but coming at very different times than it did before, and much less predictably. That includes up at high altitudes. The combination of those first 2 points means that the mountains across Nepal have a lot less snow on them than they did when I was a child growing up here. My parents served with UMN when I was growing up. And climate change makes worse a lot of other environmental degradation in Nepal that's caused by, for example, the conversion of forest into farmland or into fast-growing urban areas, especially in the flatter parts of Nepal. And I want to just share some pictures and stories about what that looks like in practice, and also the kinds of things that we're trying to do to address the impacts of climate change. So first, here's a wee map of Nepal, a biodiversity map, and a couple of the more charismatic and famous Nepal species, the snow leopard and the red panda. As you can see, Nepal has a remarkable number of biodiversity zones, from the trans-Himalayan desert over in Tibet to the high Himalaya in red, and then moving down through various belts of hills of different heights, until finally at the south side of this map, you get to the Terai Plains, this quite flat green section of Nepal right next to India. And as you can imagine, with all of these different biodiversity zones and sort of north-south river valleys going through the hills all across Nepal, the diversity of species and also of human diversity of languages and ethnic groups developing isolated from each other in those north-south valleys is like few other places on Earth. And yet also because of this topography, the hills and these narrow valleys, as the average temperature starts rising in many of these areas, you get biodiversity being sort of locked out. You get the heat is driving animals further up isolated hill ranges from which they have nowhere else to go. And we're seeing species die out, not yet these charismatic ones that I see here, that I've shown here, but a lot of Nepal's plant and small animal diversity is being affected by the increase in temperatures. The monsoon is just about to start here in Nepal. These big annual winds blowing in off the Indian Ocean, bringing tremendous amounts of daily rain with them. And it used to be, again, when I was a child growing up here, you could set your calendar, as it were, by the start of the monsoon date. It was very, very reliable from year to year. You'd rarely get more than a few days off in terms of when the rains would start and then when they'd stop after a few months. That predictability is gone. And the farming patterns that were based on it are gone. And that leads to farmers doing things that they've been, the practices that they've been using for generations are no longer giving them the same kind of crop yield that they used to, because the rain's not coming on time, or it's coming too heavily in a particular moment and waterlogging the crops at the wrong point in their development. And different pests are coming because the climate is drier for longer or wetter for longer. And overall, this variability in the monsoon in a country where so many people depend on agriculture for their livelihood and for their food is having a really negative impact on villages all across the country. At its extreme, the variability is creating more frequent and intense drought, where the rain just doesn't come for months. And this is a picture of the Terai, the plains, and what would have been a rice field. Rice, of course, depends very heavily on being submerged completely in water at the right times of its growth cycle. And if you can get water in at the beginning and then the water supply dries up because you haven't had rain in weeks, you'll get a picture like this, where ultimately that rice is going to die without any seed, without any yield. Livestock die in droughts. The water mills that many rural villages in the hills depend on for power are no longer running. And of course, when the local water supplies go dry, people rely on unsafe water much more. They'll be going to the big rivers flowing out of the mid-hills, carrying with them all of the sewage of every village that they've passed nearby, and because the well has dried up. And so you get disease prevalence getting high during dry months, higher than it used to be. And then with this variability, the same overall amount of rain falls, but if you go for a month or two without rain during a drought, you can then be absolutely hammered where all of it falls in a very short period of time. And especially you'll recall that map I showed with the yellow belt in the south, the very flat lowlands on the India border. Those can be completely inundated during intense floods, and people's houses get swept away, or the water rushes into them and sweeps away all of their belongings, ruins their food, ruins their clothes and bedding. Huge setback for people trying to come out of poverty working down in the plains in Nepal. And at the other extreme, the other type of flood that climate change has greatly increased the risk of is a glacial lake outburst flood. Glaciers all over the Himalayan range are shrinking. Often they're melting into these little high altitude valleys like this one, where the stream flow out of them gets more intense, but ultimately the volume of water being held in these big bowl valleys just increases to the point where then a heavy rain, a landslide, or an earthquake tremor can break that lake free, and suddenly these tons of water come rushing down the valley, destroying any houses or farmland or other things in their path. There are a few of these that the really big lakes up in the Everest region with a lot of large villages downstream from them, the government's trying frantically to find ways of letting out some of this water in a controlled way so that you don't have the whole Everest trekking region, the low-lying villages in the river valleys wiped out, and the trails and bridges wiped out by a sudden glacial lake outburst flood. The changes in temperature are creating changes in habitat, and that's not just leading to biodiversity loss, like I described above, but the mosquitoes are moving into more areas than they did before. The mosquitoes that carry dengue fever, for example, Nepal, in the year before COVID hit us, had its worst dengue outbreak in history, with lots of people dying and lots being incapacitated because mosquitoes were reaching, high hill districts that they'd never previously been getting to. And this epidemic of dengue just swept across the whole country. We have a shot there of the sort of misting machines that they were using to chase away the mosquitoes. And snakes. Snake bite is a major health problem for lowland Nepal. By the way, I apologize for the construction going on in the house next door, and they're sawing through some metal right now, if that's making the dreadful din. But you can see there one of the effects of snake bite on a person who's, the venom did lasting tissue damage to their arm. Our hospitals already treat thousands of snakebite patients a year during snakebite season, but that season's getting extended because of the different temperature change. And some of the most poisonous snakes, their range is changing to be higher up in the hills than it was before. And so families, farmers, children who'd never encountered those kinds of snakes before and don't know how to recognize them are encountering them for the first time with deadly consequences. Landslides are a constant problem in a country where the mountains are still growing really fast by geological terms. A few centimeters every year. That ends up leading to slopes that are very steep and destabilized by earth tremors. The 2015 earthquakes left lots of slopes destabilized in ways where all it takes is a big, heavy rainfall of the kind that we're now getting more than we used to. And you can have a scenario like this where whole hillsides come down and demolish extensive areas, villages. And a few specific disasters that we've had to respond to during my time, or that have affected us during my time here in Nepal. First, in 2017, there were absolutely devastating floods all across the Terai, the plains in the south of the country. And you can see here the kinds of people who are most affected, people living in shantytown villages on the outskirts of the major cities of the Terai, living in areas that are unsafe, in floodplains near to the rivers. And in this particular area, that community and the shelf of sand that it's built on, that used to extend for another 100 or meters so out toward where the river is now. But all of the houses that were there were washed away, and the little gardens that people were growing their food in were washed away, and people's goods, people's cattle, people's livestock and goats were washed away in these floods. And in 2017, the flooding was so intense that some of the districts in the Terai, 80% of the land was underwater in the day following the flood. That's the kind of flood that, it used to happen, this is the kind of flood that has always happened from time to time in the valleys, but they're happening much more now and more intensely because of climate change. All of that heat in the atmosphere is also creating storms of an intensity that Nepal's never known before. I remember in March 2019, we were getting words of a windstorm destroying houses. And I was seeing the pictures and thinking, I have never seen a windstorm in Nepal have this level of damage. Nepal gets some pretty strong winds in the hill valleys at times, enough that you can make you feel like it's going to pick you up and blow you away. But this kind of damage I'd never seen before. And indeed, by the end of the day, the government was reporting that actually they'd concluded this had been Nepal's first ever tornado in recorded history. And the reason why that had never happened before and is happening now is because there's so much more heat energy in the atmosphere that it can create storms of greater intensity than we've ever seen before. And just this year, when I was out hiking with my family on a brief break during the lull between coronavirus waves, we happened to be walking during the time when all across Nepal, because of the long dry spell this winter, there were the worst wildfires in a decade. Tremendous amounts of smoke got pumped into the air. Kathmandu for a few days had the worst air quality in the entire world because of the smoke impact of these wildfires. And even 100 miles away, trekking in eastern Nepal, we'd get up in the morning and see that where we should be seeing snow mountains, we could barely see the hill a little ways ahead of us because of all the haze in the air. And again, wildfires have always happened in Nepal, but the scale and the frequency of large fires is completely changed now. This calendar is just, I'm not going to go through it in great detail, but you can see here, hopefully, that there are, before 2005 and after 2005, different calendars that the monsoon rains used to be from the beginning of June to mid-September. Now they're a whole month shorter on average than they used to be in terms of reliability. The variability of that first couple of weeks in June and the first couple of weeks in September is so great now that you can't count on rain during those periods in the way that you used to be able to. The winter is shorter. There are a lot fewer cold days, and that makes a big difference in how much snow sticks around to feed streams and wells in the hills for the rest of the year. The summer is much longer. Frost in hilly districts vastly shorter than it used to be. Snowfall in a couple of the districts that we work in is less than half of the months that you used to have snowfall you have it today. Floods and landslides are high frequency in the same months as they were before, but the intensity and frequency of them during those months is much greater because of the greater intensity of rainfall. Drought is happening much more often throughout the year. The sort of little rainy seasons that used to take place that you could count on in between the monsoons those are much less reliable now. And as a result, you've got more likelihood of drought at different times of year. Various waterborne diseases are happening much more often. Pests and disease in crops, the whole season where you'd prepare for that has shifted to be a lot later because of the changes in temperature and rainfall. And diseases that used to be confined to the post-monsoon season in livestock, animals, and poultry are now happening year-round because of these changes. So what are we doing as a mission to respond to this? In villages like this, in Rukum, these little villages, Rangsi and Takasera, you can see that it's a fairly dry bit of the hills. A lot of the fields, these terraces that you see cut into the hills around the village, they're not going to have crops in them for a lot of the year because they rely largely on rainfall. And only during the rainy seasons do you see the green springing up there, and a lot of low scrubby trees are around the rest of the time. How are they coping with less rain, and how are we helping them? Well, one thing we're doing across Nepal is improving irrigation, so that we're making the most use of the water supply that there is, more reliable throughout the year. We're helping farmers grow new crops. In Rangsi, that village I showed before, we helped them start apple orchards, which would make better use of the limited water supply that they have. In another part, these are hills just next to the Terai. We're helping people grow these acabare peppers, extremely hot chili peppers that sell for a large amount down in the nearby bazaars, and that grow with less water than the rice that they traditionally cultivated. And we also help them identify new varieties of rice that are less badly affected if the rain is late. This is a relief distribution that we gave after the big floods in the Terai in 2017. We gave more in terms of a whole half month's food supply and non-food items to people who were in need because of those floods. We also helped people after major floods to readjust to the damage that did to their livelihoods. You know, this was a village after a really major flood that left 2 feet of sand over everything. So all of the soil they used to grow their crops in is completely inaccessible. They're living in a desert. But we help them identify melons that could grow well in 2 feet of sand, and adjust their livelihoods to other things as well. Skills that are, you know, non-farm skills, like the making of concrete rings for wells, or in the photos here, traditional weaving of Dhaka fabric, which a lot of Nepali traditional clothing is made out of. The training we gave in that was so popular that a whole village now, every woman, every household invested in a loom like this using their own money, trained each other, and that village is now known as the main local source of this kind of fabric. So they're not as reliant as they used to be on agriculture. We're trying to help reforest or afforest bits of Nepal that have had fewer, where the trees have been cut down. That helps retain water in the soil, helps prevent landslides. The moringa tree also is one that has a lot of health benefits from the fruit and seeds that it has. And we're doing other things as well that I'm afraid I didn't have time to include in this presentation. I think I'm already running pretty close to my total time, but what more is needed? And I'd say that the first thing we need is an effective COP. We need effective global action to reduce carbon emissions. We need rich countries around the world and rich populations around the world. We need us to reduce our carbon emissions. And that needs to happen through policy changes, and it needs to happen for us individually and as congregations making the changes that Martin described so well. And if we don't invest in that, but we just keep sending money to help the poor, we're sending money to help the poor, but the problems and crises that are being created by climate get more and more and eat up what we're able to do. So I'm not saying don't give us money, but I am saying give a really high priority to investing in reducing carbon emissions in your congregation and your household, because ultimately it's that change. Without major changes on that front, so much of what we are doing with the poor of Nepal is going to be wiped out by climate changes in future. And with that said, I think we, yes, continue to support adaptation programs like the ones that we're doing in villages across Nepal, and loss and damage compensation, as Martin mentioned. Nepal has already been tremendously damaged, as I hope this presentation makes clear, by the impacts of climate change. It hasn't received the benefits of much of the carbon in the atmosphere. It's borne the burden, and we need a just system globally for Nepal to be compensated for the devastation that's been caused by the lifestyles of people in the West.